This looping flowchart sequence maps an observed behavioral pattern in a highly specific clinical case study. Over the course of years, the subject cycles through serial affairs, an ensuing pregnancy, a concealed medical abortion, and rapid reintegration into her marriage. The concealment phase relies on sophisticated narrative control. The elective abortion is actively framed as a spontaneous miscarriage, presented as a medical tragedy to both the husband and the surrounding community. This careful deception masks extreme, catastrophic risk. The cycle frequently involves a return to the original forbidden affair partner, threatening the subject's marriage, her social standing, and physical safety. Clinicians face a sharp paradox here. The behavior exhibits both intense calculation and severe self-destructive compulsion. Standard diagnostic frameworks split on how to categorize this. Model A views the behavior as antisocial strategic deception, cold, calculated lying. Model B treats it as pure structural dissociation, where a traumatized individual acts without conscious awareness or memory integration. Neither framework survives scrutiny. Cold calculation fails to explain the compulsive return to a specific high-risk partner, while pure automaticity cannot account for the intricate planning required to fake a miscarriage and manage a secret medical procedure. Compared against standard models is a third framework, the mixed model. It proposes a hybrid system initiated by unconscious trauma, executed through conscious deception. To persist, it relies on 6 interlocking mechanisms: disorganized attachment, trauma conditioning, identity compartmentalization, reward circuitry, shame regulation, and honor culture secrecy. The subject in this case study has a documented history of severe childhood sexual abuse by her father. The adult behavioral cycle we are analyzing mirrors that abuse structurally, step by step. To understand how a person can be simultaneously driven by unconscious trauma and capable of conscious deception, we have to chronologically deconstruct the 8-phase behavioral loop and map these 6 mechanisms directly onto it. This circular 8-node flowchart tracks the chronology of the loop. It begins at phase 1, stability. The individual's apparently normal part manages daily marital and cultural duties, while the traumatized emotional state remains strictly sequestered. Phase 2 is the trigger. Accumulated unprocessed emotional pressure from marital dissatisfaction or unresolved trauma breaches a critical threshold, pushing the subject out of the stability phase. The 2019 Gratz and Toll longitudinal study maps exactly how this works. Emotional dysregulation, specifically the inability to accept negative emotional states, acts as the direct biological bridge between PTSD symptoms and risky sexual behavior. This forces phase 3, affair initiation. Here, the behavior links directly to the subject's disorganized attachment style, formed during the childhood abuse. Lyons-Ruth's Harvard Family Pathway Study demonstrated that early unresolvable fear, what researchers call fright without solution, hardwires the brain for contradictory approach and flee behaviors in adulthood. The abuser was both the source of terror and the required source of comfort. Maintaining a dual life externally satisfies this fractured internal architecture. The marriage provides safety, which triggers avoidant panic. The affair provides forbidden intensity, which triggers the approach system. This animation illustrates the neurobiological driver at work. PTSD induces reward deficiency, leaving the individual in a blunted baseline hedonic state. Routine life feels numb. The brain requires extreme stimuli, novelty, risk, and secrecy to trigger a dopamine response. The affair initiation is not driven by hedonistic pleasure. It is an unconscious, dopamine-fueled attempt to artificially regulate a fractured attachment system. The sequence moves into phase 4, escalation. As the affair deepens, the individual rapidly alternates between the marital self and the affair self. Clinical literature distinguishes standard detachment from true compartmentalization. In this state, the subject holds contradictory self-presentations across different contexts without recognizing the incoherence between them. This brings us to phase 5, the crisis. A pregnancy occurs during the affair phase, abruptly shattering the compartmentalization and forcing the two lives to collide. A pregnancy from a forbidden partner is not an arbitrary accident. It is a structural isomorphism of the subject's childhood intrafamilial abuse. The early abuse established a specific, somatically stored procedural sequence: sexual contact, followed by pregnancy, followed by complicit medical intervention, followed by strict concealment. Freud originally conceptualized this as repetition compulsion. Modern neurobiology reframes it through procedural memory. Traumatized nervous systems default to familiar behavioral sequences under extreme stress, regardless of the consequences. The likelihood of this specific crisis occurring is multiplied by the subject's highly dissociative state during the affair, which severely impairs executive planning and self-protective behaviors, like contraceptive use. The discovery of the pregnancy represents a critical pivot point. The subject transitions instantly from unconscious trauma reenactment into a state requiring highly conscious, strategic survival skills. In Phase 6, concealment, the subject obtains an elective abortion, but actively presents it to her husband and community as a spontaneous miscarriage. Guilt relies on the evaluation of an action, "I did something bad," and motivates repair. Shame relies on a global evaluation of the self, "I am bad," and motivates hiding. For an individual whose identity is organized around the internalized belief of being damaged goods, narrative control ceases to be an instrumental lie. It becomes an existential necessity. The miscarriage narrative specifically reveals a high degree of psychological sophistication. Framing the abortion as a miscarriage actively elicits sympathy, physical protection, and caregiving from the husband, rather than triggering suspicion or rage. By utilizing this exact explanation, the subject successfully overwrites a socially unacceptable choice with a socially acceptable tragedy. This narrative technology converts the moment of maximum vulnerability and potential exposure into a moment of relational reinforcement. As this flowchart completes its circle at Phase 7, reintegration occurs. The trauma-linked emotional state subsides, and the apparently normal part reasserts full control over the subject's behavior. Phase 8 marks post-crisis bonding. This is characterized by the rapid occurrence of a legitimate pregnancy with the husband. This legitimate pregnancy serves dual functional mechanisms. It increases the subject's structural investment in the marriage, and it serves as private identity repair, providing a narrative redemption sequence to counter the recent trauma. The overall success of the concealment phase provides massive negative reinforcement. By surviving the crisis without exposure, the subject's nervous system receives definitive proof that the deception strategy works. The subject's genuine relief and authentic recommitment to the marriage in this phase is real. But because the underlying trauma remains entirely unprocessed, emotional pressure immediately begins accumulating for the next cycle. This diagram encases the internal loop within a rigid boundary. These psychological mechanisms are sustained by the cultural environment. In honor-based societies, the cultural practice of citra, or concealment, operates as a strict social control mechanism to prevent collective shame. This environment creates a violently asymmetric payoff matrix. The cost of disclosure, ostracism, physical violence, or the loss of children, vastly outweighs the exhausting psychological effort of continued concealment. During her childhood, the subject's family system and complicit medical institutions historically enforced strict secrecy around her abuse, creating a developmental deep freeze. The subject did not invent this deceptive framework. She internalized a family operating system that explicitly modeled secrecy and medical collusion as the absolute only viable responses to sexual trauma. This macro-level map view illustrates the final behavioral piece: frequent geographic relocations to new countries following a crisis, retaining its exact shape across borders. This is known clinically as the Geographic Cure. A fresh start temporarily severs community surveillance networks and relieves immediate social pressure. The cure fails because moving only addresses the external surveillance. It leaves the internal drivers, attachment and trauma memory, her core identity, a reward deficiency, and shame, entirely intact. As the novelty of the new location wears off, the dopamine-starved reward system reactivates. The internal emotional pressure reaches a critical threshold, and the cycle reemerges in the new environment with identical structural fidelity. Clinical analysis of this pattern yields a distinct warning. Any intervention targeting only one mechanism, like forcing disclosure or restricting physical opportunity, will cause compensatory escalation, not resolution. This behavioral loop occupies the complex, highly resistant middle ground between complete agency and pure automaticity. Breaking a self-perpetuating cycle of this magnitude requires dismantling both the internal trauma pathways and the external systemic architecture that makes survival dependent on deception.